Noises After Dark, moved by the devastating media coverage of the humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia in 85, John Tomlinson packed his bags to volunteer for the Save the Children Fund, with the intent to help rebuild and run a small hospital in a northern Somali town on the border with Ethiopia. He has written a book about his experiences called Noises After Dark. Delighted to be joining me live on the line, John Tomlinson himself. John, good morning to you.
Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Pleasure is all mine. Many of us were moved by the photographs coming out of Ethiopia in 84, of course. We remember Band Aid, etc., and it had a huge effect on the British public in particular. Just tell us a little bit about your experience and what it meant to you.
Well, at the time, I was still a sort of junior doctor in the United Kingdom, and I remember seeing the pictures on the television, and I guess at the time I was quite moved by the whole thing. But like many people, I sort of made a donation and got on with my day-to-day job. But it wasn't until I was sort of sitting with my friends watching the Live Aid concert. And I think that obviously is one of the biggest things that's ever been on television. And again, that sort of made me think, sort of just sitting there. And I thought, well, actually, as a doctor, I could give more than just donating money. So I sort of talked to sort of friends and family and so on, and decided to volunteer with Save the Children Fund. And I was posted to the very top of Somalia, and people say, well, you know, obviously the pictures were from Ethiopia, but in that part of Somalia, many of the refugees from Ethiopia had come over the border. So the idea was that my post was to run a small hospital. Well, I say run, there wasn't much of a hospital there when I first got there because it had to be rebuilt. But the idea was that the hospital would be supplying a service to the local town, a surrounding population. And although each of the refugee camps had clinics, I suppose you would call them, in them to deal with everyday sort of simple cases, that the idea was that the hospital would take a lot of referrals from the refugee camps for more complicated cases.
I mean, how old were you then at that? But if you don't mind me asking, because obviously it makes... had you seen much of the world at that point? Was it the idealism of youth, you could say?
Well, I'd already been abroad, so a couple of things really. One is that I went to Liverpool Medical School, and it's one of the few medical schools in Europe that also has a tropical medical school.
Ah.
So I'd already got a sort of, an interest in tropical diseases. But I'd worked with quite an inspirational sort of consultant who was from the West Indies. And so at one point in my life, prior to going to Somalia, I went to work at the hospital in Kingston in Jamaica for 12 months.
Because I'm just... And what was Save the Children's reaction when you sort of rocked up and said, I'm a junior doctor, I'd like to help? I mean, because presumably they were getting lots of offers from people who wanted to help, but perhaps didn't have the tools in the toolbox to actually be much use?
Well, that's a good point, because when I first applied to them, I had a very rapid answer. So, and I think that there probably weren't as many people as you think at a sort of doctor level offering to help. So the thing was that there was two jobs on offer. One was in the Sudan and one was in Somalia, and I sort of knew a little bit more about Sudan. I knew very little about Somalia at the time. And one of the interesting things, I guess, was that I couldn't even find... This is pre-internet days, of course, when it would be very easy now. But I couldn't even find... in any atlas that I looked at, a complete map of Somalia. And I even went down to see a friend in Cambridge, and we went to Cambridge University thinking that, the library there would be able to help me. But even they didn't actually have a whole map that they could show me of Somalia. So when I rocked up to the interview, I was really thinking possibly about taking the job in Sudan. And I walked into the office, and there was a big map of Somalia on the wall with a big arrow pointing to a little town called Boroma. And I thought, that's obviously what they're going to talk about. And the job in Sudan was never mentioned.
Right.
And I accepted the job in Somalia. And I guess, my view was, well, if that's where they need me to go, then that's where I should go. And initially, the job was for 6 months.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, I'm only going for 6 months, so I'll just give it a whirl, see what I can do, and do my best. But I'm what you call a completer finisher, so I get great satisfaction out of completing things I've discovered in my management training. And so I didn't stay for 6 months, I stayed for 2.5 years.
That's what you call a bit of finishing. Now, first impressions, because you've got this idea of what it's going to be like. You've seen the TV programs, the TV reports. You're braced for the scenes that you might see. But were you braced for everything else? The heat, the conditions, the presumably dust, and explain what it's like on the, because again, for those of us who haven't been there, we just think that the whole situation was terribly malnourished babies, especially children, wandering around basically in rags in this sort of dust bowl nightmare scenario. Was that the reality?
No. I guess where I was posted was in a sort of a normal everyday town that itself was not experiencing the sort of the famine and the devastation of the scenes that you saw in Ethiopia. But of course, that's the very reason why refugees were going over the border to that area. So where I was living was a town of about 60,000 people, so not particularly large. In the sort of rainy season, it would be a little bit greener, and there was rivers with water in. But in the dry season, those riverbeds would dry up, and they'd be become a little bit more of a dust bowl. But there was plenty of trees and so on around in that sort of area, and you could see the mountains of Ethiopia were on the sort of horizon, only 9 kilometers away. But of course, you weren't allowed to go there because you weren't allowed to go over the border into Ethiopia at the time, because the border was officially sort of closed, except for refugees coming our way. So that was sort of the background, and of course, it started off like that, but there was always a little bit of civil unrest, shall we say, going on. And so during my time there, it flipped from being a relatively peaceful place to being a civil war. And then, of course, there were many scenes from Somalia, which people will remember. Black Hawk Down and all the films that came out at the time of the civil war that sort of started. And of course, the civil war pretty much started in the area where I was living and spread across the whole of Somalia from there.
Because this is one of the things that exacerbated the situation is the clash of warlords. I mean, did you feel, as a hospital and as a white man going over, that was the wrong word. You know what I'm saying? As a foreigner going over there to Africa, it's an interesting situation because some people might say, "Oh, thank you for coming, save the children. This is great," and other people might say, "Well, where were you guys 20 years ago, or what are you actually doing for us here?" And there'd be a certain amount of resentment amongst perhaps some of the other professionals there.
Not in that way. I mean, I must admit, I felt relatively protected. I think because most people were very, very supportive of you being there, very welcoming of the fact that you were offering to help and re-establish a hospital there and so on. But they were, the general members of the public. It was sometimes a little bit more difficult engaging people at a higher level in society, and some of the government officials were not always the easiest to deal with. And one of the main issues in Somalia was, although it was very poor, one of the key areas of government that was well funded was the secret police, who had been trained by the KGB when the country had been more aligned to Russia during the Cold War years. And they monitored absolutely everything that happened in the country. And so many of the people that you worked with, they were seen to be spending too much time with you. They would often be questioned by the secret police to find out why were they spending time with you and what were they doing and what were they talking about. And there were things like, it was at the time against the law to be listening to the BBC World Service and things like that if you were a local person. So, it wasn't that side of life was not
And you were rebuilding a hospital. I mean, are we using the word hospital in its loosest possible terms here? And were you prepared for sort of what we found that was there? Were they sort of basically, what was the staffing level like, and what were the supplies like?
Well, as far as the hospital is concerned, it's not what you would call a hospital here. It was a series of very simple buildings made of breeze blocks and tin sheet roofing. It had been very badly damaged by some sort of small earthquakes, but also because it had been bombed by the Ethiopian Air Force a year or two before I sort of went there. So one of the first things was to offer a service from whatever bits of rubble there were, but also to get the hospital rebuilt. And I guess when I first went out there, I didn't think that one of my first tasks was going to be digging latrines, but it was as it was as basic as that, really, and trying to get at least some sense of a hospital together so that you could work in it, and to extend it a little bit, because there was only a couple of wards that were working, mostly for men, and there wasn't really much of a service for the women and the children. And the idea was that I was supposed to be there to provide a service for the women and the children, and there was a local Somali counterpart doctor who was there to look after the male side of the hospital.
I mean, I suppose the giveaway is in the name of the charity Save the Children, isn't it, really?
Indeed,
yes, indeed.
But I suppose in addition to the structure, there were very few medicines. Yeah. There was no equipment, there were no beds or anything like that. People were just lying on blankets on the floor if there was any building where the roof worked, as it were.
So how do you go about sort of restructure or dealing with this? Because presumably you weren't existing in isolation. I mean, is it a case of treating what you've got in front of you, and then can you send to other hospitals? Is it a part of a network? I'm just because there's a little talk about health systems at the moment and where people are being sent and etc. But if you're in a small town in northern Somalia, can you send them off to Mogadishu and say, okay, well, or is it? Are we thinking sort of country/field hospital here?
If I paint a picture first, because I mean, where I was based was actually quite remote. So, starting off by travelling out there from the UK, it would take you 2 to 3 days to get there. That's the first thing.
Right.
There would be there's no phone system. There's no local radio or television. And of course, this is pre-internet, sort of pre-mobile phone world. And so your only sort of contact with the outside world is the BBC World Service on your little radio with rechargeable batteries. Visits by a more senior sort of manager from Save the Children Fund. They used to come up from Mogadishu sometimes to see us. And you would get letters which would be sent to a post box in neighbouring Djibouti, which is on the sort of up on the Red Sea opposite Aden and so on, and the Yemen. And we used to have supply vehicles used to go every 1 or 2 months to Djibouti to get supplies, and they would pick up your post and bring that back to you. The actual hospital was covering an area about the size of Wales, but with an unknown population, probably about 400,000 people, a lot of whom would be nomads. There'd be sort of villages and small towns dotted around, but not that many, really, of any sort of significant size. And there would be quite a sizable nomad population who would be looking after their sort of camels, goats, sheep, sort of thing. And that was quite a big money earner for the local people there. They would take the livestock down to places like Djibouti and sell them, and they'd all be put on ships and end up in many places, usually in the Middle East. And then from my town, it would be about a 2.5 hour drive on a mostly untarmacked dirt road through the mountains. down to a place called Hargeisa, which people may or may not have heard of, and that's the sort of next biggest place after Mogadishu. And Hargeisa had a slightly bigger hospital, but if I'm honest with you, the facilities weren't that much better. They had with slightly better supplies and so on. But that's where the surgery took place. So if anybody needed surgery, they had to be taken on that journey back down to Hargeisa, where there was local surgeons, but most of the training was undertaken by Chinese surgeons who were there to sort of try and help out in that hospital.
I'm just because a friend of mine just got back from working in southwest South Morocco, and they'd been doing sort of medical stuff and dentistry and stuff like that, emergency dentistry, and they said as soon as they know that somebody's in town who knows what they're doing, you suddenly get a huge queue. Did you suddenly, because you'd arrived, they knew that children, Save the Children were there. You mentioned the nomads, but did you find obviously there was an increased demand then of people as people sort of knew that there was that level of competence, or if you like, or that level of aid available?
Immediately within 24 hours of arrival.
Wow. That's what you call a communication network. That's what you call it, a communication network.
A queue out the door 60 long, yes. So, yes, an immediate effect, really. Starting from my very first day there, people had already been told that a doctor would be arriving from the UK. There had been 2 nurses from Save the Children that had already been working there for a number of weeks before I arrived, so they'd already started the ball rolling. But yes, as soon as I arrived, then there was an immediate upturn in the work, and including people that had travelled a long way, nomads that had travelled, many hours overland to get there.
Yeah, sorry. And it was all sorts of cases you were dealing with. It wasn't just purely the effects of travelling and all malnutrition or something like that.
The thing is, whenever you go to these places, people think they're going to be rammed with tropical diseases or something, and the truth is that common diseases are common, and so there's all the things that you would get here. But then, there are more cases of things like, an example would be TB. Mm-hmm. So TB, if a nomad came in through the door, you could flick a coin to predict how likely they were to have TB. It was that common. The people in the town were less affected by that, but of course the nomads are living with animals who often will be carrying TB. There would be a lot of, yes, as you say, the malnutrition and chronic diarrhea and that sort of thing. We had a little bit of malaria. The town itself didn't have malaria, but it was surrounded by areas that would get malaria. Yeah. But we also had a lot of burns cases because people live in small sort of dome-shaped dwellings made out of stick and anything else that they can sort of cover it with to make it weatherproof. But they have open fires where they do their cooking, and I've got loads of photographs to sort of show that to people when I'm giving talks and so on. But obviously, you can't see that on the radio. But if you imagine, people have taken twigs from local acacia trees and they've stretched them to make them, like a sort of semicircle sort of rods, a bit like putting a tent up, and then they've slapped plastic sheets or whatever they've got available to sort of make it weatherproof. And then in the middle of that, there's this little tiny open fire. So we had a lot of children who had played or during their sleep had rolled into the ashes of the fire and things like that that would be coming into the hospital. Very, very common. Yeah. But the biggest issue was very, very poor health in general of women, and particularly pregnant women. And within a very, very short period of time, what was quite upsetting for me, I guess, and my fellow team, was that we lost quite a few pregnant women shortly after delivery. And that was because they were simply so anemic, you'd question how they managed to even walk around with their levels of hemoglobin and so on in their blood that carries the oxygen was so low that you wondered how they were surviving. But they got to the stage of pregnancy, and then they deliver their baby. They lose a little bit of blood, and it just tips them over, and they go into heart failure, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. They die because we weren't in a position when we first arrived to do any. The only thing that would work in such an urgent situation would be a blood transfusion, and we weren't able to do anything like that when we first arrived. And so that was actually, quite traumatising for the staff to lose people so easily. And I guess death was very cheap.
Yeah, I'm just going to think about sort of women's medicine or whatever. There's cultural differences as well, isn't there? Especially in that region of Somalia, there are quite a few cultural differences about how you treat women and how women. There are the issues around that as well, which must have been eye-opening for you.
Yes, I guess there were many families that were quite liberal, forward-thinking, and they would have many sort of Western ideas and approach to life. So, don't think everybody's like that. But obviously, many people, particularly nomads, would be very traditional in their views on life. Women would often eat after the men and often after the children. So, and the diet wasn't always very rich in its iron content. So diet was an issue, but obviously if you keep having bouts of malaria, the malaria helps sort of destroy blood cells, so therefore that in itself can make the anemia worse. And people were having, the women were often having very, very frequent pregnancies, very high death rate and pregnancy loss rate. So, people would be getting pregnant several times a year, in many cases, but not obviously keeping the babies, often losing them. But after every pregnancy, it does have an effect on the level of blood that you have in your body. So, and very little family planning. So that was probably one of the major issues. So a mixture of diet, things like malaria, and too frequent pregnancies, all culminating in a very, very poor level of iron in the blood and therefore very severe anemia.
Well, look, the book is called Noises After Dark. Why that, John?
Because there was always noises after dark, and for those who do read the book, they will discover that there were noises after dark throughout my story.
Right.
So that's why I chose that. Some of them good, some of them bad, without doing any spoilers for the story.
Fine. Looking back, because obviously you're now in the UK. I mean, without trying to go all American on you and schmaltzy, but do you think that you made a difference? And if you had the chance to do it all again, because eventually, I won't give all the book away, but there are things take a turn for the worse, to put it mildly, for you in terms of false imprisonment, etc. And obviously the situation deteriorates as we talk about the Somali war and the tribal situation there. So if you had to do it all again, would you do it all again? And do you think you made a difference? And do you think it's important for doctors to get out there and do the work they do?
First of all, in answer to your last question, yes, I think it's extremely important. And you would say, well, I would say that, but I think that we did make a difference. The shame was for the Civil War to sort of more or less take away everything that we did, because prior to that we had got the hospital into a very good shape, and we trained lots of people, and because the idea was not to set up anything which the government couldn't afford, because the aim was to hand the hospital over to the government to run over in a number of years' time. So if we introduced very fancy equipment or tests and so on, which the government couldn't afford to sustain afterwards, then it would just all crumble. So it was a constant dilemma to think about what should we introduce, what should we maintain, what can they afford. And sometimes, of course, that meant that you had very difficult decisions, because someone was going to possibly die in front of you if you didn't do something that wasn't in the longer term sustainable, so that there were occasions when you broke your own rules to save somebody's life there and then, to do something which you know there wouldn't be anyone to do if you weren't there in the future, and they wouldn't be able to afford to do that. But that was just part of life of being there, I guess. And you will see in the book where we got to with all of that. But of course, then when the fighting started, a lot of that work was undermined. So in the book, it's a book of two halves. So the first half is very much about the sorts of things that we've been discussing, and the second half of the book is where it becomes a more unsafe place, because it becomes a civil war and you're surrounded by mayhem. But what I would say to your listeners is important for me is that when you read a lot of these books on humanitarian work, they can make for a heavy read sometimes, and they focus on the bombs and the bullets and all the more harrowing things. I've tried in my book to introduce some humour, because I think that wherever you go in the world, funny things happen. So don't just think the book is all about woeful stories, because it's not. There's times when I hope I'll make people laugh.
Yeah, because I think that is a thing. We have a tendency to go, a bit of hand-wringing, and, especially with Africans. I mean, they do have an innate sense of humour that is quite unlike anywhere else in the world, don't they?
Well, and it's also, healthcare workers have to have a sense of humour to keep sane even in the UK. So,
especially in the UK, I'd say now. So, if people want to find you, do you do the social media? Is there a web page? Where can people find you, John?
Well, I'm not great at that. So, as far as finding me is concerned, I'm more elusive. But finding the book's very easy.
Yeah.
So just by Googling the name of the book and my name, many websites will come up.
Indeed, it'll be available as a virtual download as well. The book is called Noises After Dark, Memoirs of a Doctor in East Africa. It's by John Tomlinson. John, thank you so much for your time today.